I'm so thrilled again to welcome Aviv Ovadya and Kim Osborne here. Kim has been on, I think, now twice in our Foresight online salons. Once was on communication in crisis scenarios, which was just, it's a really fantastic video. I all recommend you to watch it. She's kind of like going through her own experience on really having served in almost every possible crisis scenario. Her lessons learned there as a kind of like communication specialist, and how to package information so that it's useful and for the people that are on the receiving end of it, and really has advised a lot of leaders nationally and internationally in how to help the general public to make sense of situations. So I'm really happy to have Kim on again. Kim, I'm going to make you a co-host right now, so you can unmute yourself whenever you'd like and chime in. And then on the other hand, I'm also super happy to have Aviv Ovadya here, who we've been collaborating with on a prototype for a tech-wise council. This would basically be a kind of non-institutional, uninformal gathering by which different leaders try to get together and make sense of situations and help the public make sense of different emerging technology threats in a way that is more fluid than we currently can do with institutions. And so we have been prototyping this at Foresight on the specific case of deepfakes as they're pertaining to the upcoming election. Aviv has been a fantastic source of information for their project. That's how we met him, and then I think since then we've been on an online salon with us before, and with the one where Kim was on. I'm really happy that you found the time to join today again. He has been spearheading sense-making efforts across platforms. One really amazing group, which you may want to request that he gives you admission to, is a fantastic sense-making group on viral exploration that's trying to dig a little bit into the science behind COVID-19. So thank you so much for joining. Aviv, I'm also going to make you a co-host. And I'm hoping that given the fact that we have two folks now, I'm hoping that we can actually have a lot of like back and forth going on. And I'm only going to try to chime in if I would love to, if I would love to make sure that we cover a different thread, perhaps as well. But please feel free to take me out of this equation as much as possible and just talk as much as possible as you want amongst yourself, and only refer back to me if you might. Okay, bring up the questions here. We have a few different questions that I contributed, and that they are kind of based on the action items from the last session. I think this is just to kind of like warm ourselves up and keep us going. But feel free to dive into other topics too, as you wish. The one, I think, maybe to bring others up to speed again of where we left off at the last meeting, one thing that, I think we could be starting with is this question of, which kind of sense-making role models and which cautionary tales has COVID-19 exposed? So, if we take this analogy that it's like wartime and you kind of see which things are actually working and which aren't working, what are a few kind of like specific either people or projects that are doing a really, really good job at sense-making, and conversely, who is failing quite spectacularly? If any one of you would like to take a go at that, perhaps Kim, you'd like to start us off.
Well, I haven't. I think maybe I'd like to address that by not looking at particular individuals, but maybe best practices or some of the things that I've seen that work that I have seen that are not working here or that are working well. And when I think about the advice that I've been called to give in such high crisis or high visibility situations, one of the things that I think is absolutely imperative that I have sometimes seen stumbling in this recent crisis is a lack of transparency and trust. And it's absolutely essential to build trust with your audience when you're, especially during a crisis, and especially when there really is no option except to have people move in the direction that you want them to. I mean, I guess there's always an option, but it would be an option toward failure if people don't comply or if people don't follow what you want. And so, when I look at the response, sometimes I guess I will look at a specific example now that it's coming to mind. When I'm looking at the way that some senior leaders in the United States are responding, then it's not one that engenders trust. There's a lot of confusion on the messages that are coming out between what scientists are saying and what politicians are saying. And it looks like there certainly are competing narratives. And it looks like there's also, from a consumer perspective, it looks like there's a lot of self-interest going on. And that does happen. I mean, every organization has its own self-interest to protect, but when they're working for the public good, the consumers would hope to think that the people who they've elected or the people who are representing them are working for their interests. And so when it looks like leaders are working for self-interests, it's a way, it helps to disintegrate the level of trust. And that makes it more difficult to get people to, change their beliefs or change their behaviors when that trust building isn't happening.
Yeah, for sure. Aviv, would you like to fill in?
Sorry. One of the things that I think is sort of coming out of also what Kim was saying and what I was thinking is it's not just about who is good at sense making, it's who is good at distributing that sense making that these organizations are doing or the people are doing to an audience. So it's more about distribution in this case than about understanding. Kim, is that aligned with what you're saying?
I think that's part of the equation.
Right.
I mean, distribution certainly matters.
Or and messaging, I guess, is a good way to put that.
Okay, yeah, that's, to me, I would think of distribution like, are we using social media?
Yeah.
Media? Are we using?
No, I was thinking
but right. Messaging is, absolutely imperative, and it has to be, aligned with the objectives of whatever, I hate to call it a campaign, but really, we're trying to do something here.
Right. Yeah, and so I think on that note, I would agree that there are a number of leaders around the world who are handling that messaging very well, and there's other ones who are handling that messaging very poorly. We can when we look at also which countries are doing better and which countries are doing worse, those are often highly correlated. And so I think we can all draw our own conclusions about what are some of the most important issues facing us when we look at that correlation. I think that actually would be a really interesting analysis I have not seen done. I don't know if Kim or if anyone else in the audience has seen an analysis of messaging quality and outcomes.
But it certainly makes sense that would correlate. I haven't done a formal study, no, but it makes sense because people are hungry for information. The information that they get, what you would expect would inform their actions or beliefs or, whatever their reaction is going to be to having received new information.
Right. And I guess when you're thinking about this in a how do we get these leaders, regardless whether it's in, Brazil or maybe the United States, to actually care about these things. I mean, one thing to think about is what are the things that those leaders care about? And maybe if you could show a correlation between messaging and voting more effectively, voting outcomes more effectively, maybe that could help drive some change. But I think there is some real structural obstacles. There's reasons why that messaging is bad that aren't easy to change within some of those administrations. There's structural issues and cultural issues that make it very hard for.
Can you call them out? Can you be more specific?
Let's see. trying to think of, I want to be delicate in the way in which I say this. So Kim, you feel free to chime in if you've got a delicate way of saying these things.
Well, I'm not sure. I don't want to. I'm not in your head, so.
Yeah, no. But saying like, I mean, it sounds like you agree in terms of the cultural and structural issues that.
Yeah, and like one thing that is often mentioned is like, you know, decision makers who are not beneficiaries. You know, and I think you see that like pretty crystal clear right now. But I think, you know, like putting some meat to the bone, like, you know, are there specific, you know, like we don't have to pinpoint people, but like, you know, dynamics at play right now where it's like. Where we would have a more straightforward way of going forward. For example, with Taleb's skin in the game, you know, I think that is a pretty it's a theory, but you can like it allows action recommendations.
What is it? I didn't hear that part.
I guess like more heuristics for like things that are currently going wrong in our sense making, or like different incentive misalignments which make it much harder to make sense.
Yeah, I think that's what I was thinking about when I was saying that the self-interests are often misaligned with, not often, are sometimes misaligned with the common good, or the what we hope that leaders are working toward. A specific example, or one that I've seen sometimes is, and I talked about this in a previous talk a little bit, but especially at the federal level in the United States, I've sometimes seen where, scientists are, science, is a science innovation. It's a continuum. It's not like, you hatch out of the egg and you suddenly have all of the right answers and a complete picture of what's going on. It's a progressive evolution that's informed all along the way by, other things happening in the environment. And so, I think we have seen this in the United States where, federal leaders, politicians, and certainly President Trump, but others as well, will, come out and message to the people of the country, the people of the world, to say, this is the way things are. And we think that this is the best practice, use this drug, or, we do need to quarantine, we don't need to quarantine, or, and I think a lot of that is informed by the science that's happening at the time. And so that's not, one person or one organization can't be everything to everybody. Like, I don't expect the president of the United States to be, doing science and figuring out where the latest scientific innovations are in terms of like disease cures. So I think, that's where we have to, listen to advisors, and we have to make sure that we do have good, well-informed advisors, and also recognize that the environment is changing along the way. And so that gets to like the second part of your questioning, Allison, when you were saying like, well, what can we as consumers do to make sure that the information that we're consuming and making choices about is also informing, or, we're using the best information too. So I think as a consumer, recognize that it's a dynamic process, that there are multiple parts in this big, machine, and not everyone has all the answers all of the time, but you want to think they're doing the best they can. Sorry?
So do you think that advisors were just not listened to this time? And if so, why? Given this
that's
spectacular failure.
Yeah, I would like to know that too, but you're never going to know that. I mean, I've been behind those closed doors, and the way that I personally am often interestingly fascinated by, what appears on the front page of the newspaper and what really happened. It's actually one of my favorite parts of doing this kind of work, because you get to see the sausage making, and then it's not what the public sees at all. And so if you've got a good communicator as an advisor, then they understand all of the interests of all of the players, like the media, for example, and how do they work, and what motivates them, and what do you need to say to who to get the message that you want your consumers, your stakeholders to understand and believe at the end of the day. So do I think that they have good advisors? I don't know. I would hope so. I would hope that by the time you get to that level that you are good, you do understand the systems. And, it also takes leaders, the communicators, or sorry, the principals to listen to them. And sometimes those principals, the president, the other stakeholders who are not coming to mind, they also sometimes have greater visibility than any one consumer has. So maybe there are other considerations that we don't know about. Like I said, behind those closed doors, I can't sit here and tell you,
let's hope so. Aviv, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think like one of the factors I was trying to discuss earlier, and someone mentioned don't be delicate. I'm like, well, this is, I believe, on the record, and it's not a private conversation, so I do have some personal motivation to be at least somewhat delicate, or at least somewhat conscientious about what I'm saying, is maybe a good way to say it. But I think that there is a style that some leaders have in terms of the way that they do their leadering. And so there's like a style, like, let's say a Bolsonaro might have, or a style that Trump might have. And that style might be useful for particular types of actions, either for themselves or for their country, whatever the situation may be, whatever, depending on the style. And they may be very unuseful in other situations. And so I think that, and I think we sort of see that in the way that sense making happens, in the way that messaging happens, in the way that issues are prioritized. And so like all of that, and that also has to do with maybe the audience that they're speaking to. And so if you're only speaking to a subset of the audience, then maybe you have a very different thing to say. And then there's also just like, part of this is like the psychology of the individual leaders, the principals here, and sort of are they willing to be with the crisis? Like, can they stand in and see like, okay, this crisis is actually happening? And I haven't been maybe in quite the level of closed door rooms that Kim has, but I know that just on a personal level, many people are not, and so their decisions are poor. Kim, I'm curious if that aligns with.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, they're human beings at the end of the day. We hope and expect that we can elect, at least in this country, elect someone who's going to lead us, and they're going to have the capacity to do that well. But we're all individuals, and we all have shortcomings, and we all have strengths. And no one predicted something like this when we were considering who we wanted to vote for in the last election, at the presidential level, at the congressional level, at the state level. So, I was just talking to someone who works in public health last night when I was out walking my dog. He just moved to, the Central California area where I live, from New York City. And he said, wow, I kind of dodged a bullet there. And, he was like, how could I have known that this was going to happen? And New York City, I just saw a briefing this morning from the Army, like, it's the worst hit area in the country right now. So yeah. you can't predict these things. And that's the compassionate part. I think that we as consumers, hopefully we can find the bandwidth to say, I want to believe that the people who I've elected are acting in my interest and are doing the best job they can with the information they have, and they're fallible human beings. Yeah. And what else can I do? Let me control the things that I can control. So what else can I do to make sure that I'm getting information that informs a sensible decision for myself and my family that's in alignment with my own values and priorities? So then that's.
I think like one thing that was interesting for me to see is that actually, a recent book that just came out is The Precipice by Toby Ord. And, he was mentioning pandemics as like the thing to be concerned about. Right. And that was definitely, written before the pandemic. And then you have Metaculus, I think, and as Anthony already said, Metaculus, you had very, very early warning signs of like, kind of like, I guess like safety alarms, that something was cooking up, but it's just, they don't really seem to be connected at all to the actuaries in our nation. So I would love to hear from you, perhaps, when you're trying to sense make, what are specific tools and strategies that you use when researching information, or even when communicating information, like what are kind of like best practices, specifically that people here could use. And I think Aviv was mentioning this, right, that not like in the last panel, that not even many people know how to actually search a website to find false or true information. So perhaps Aviv, you'd like to tell us a few best practices.
So, I guess for this audience, I mean, there's like, I feel like there's like things that are generally useful for people to know, like things like, how to search a website. I mean, the most important thing is like, don't look close. I mean, this is actually something that is in contrast with much media literacy education. And I'd be curious to hear, if, different perspectives on this. But traditionally media literacy has been look very closely at the source to see like, is anything off about it? And what's recommended now by those who I think have the best work in the space is more look at sources that are trustworthy and see if they corroborate. Because it's so easy to find sources that are trustworthy or existing sources that like, okay, this one maybe not be perfect, but it has these issues. This one may not be perfect in this way, but it has these issues. Go to those sources first. And don't spend time trying to figure out, is this really a real thing? From whatever sketchy site that you found on the internet. And that has issues when you're dealing with information that is only relevant to a very, very select audience. So it's not like this is across the board good. But for the vast majority of things that you see on the internet that you learn about that are false, you're going to very, very quickly find a reliable source that has realized this is a thing that's important and has said something about it. And that thing is generally going to be much better than what you would get otherwise. Now, that said, media in its current form has a number of structural issues. And you can't, like, there is a little bit of salt that you should maybe take with anything that you see. But that doesn't mean that, like, it is not still the best and fastest way to evaluate any given piece of information.
And which specific, like, if I'm now in the head of Aviv, right, and I'm doing research about a specific topic, what do you do first? Which sites do you visit and so on?
I mean, I'll just do it. Like, literally, if I'm looking up something and I see some weird claim, like, the first thing I'll do is I'll do a Google search on the claim, right? If I'm looking at and I'll find the most specific keywords I can to do that very quickly. And it takes like a second, and often I'll figure out immediately that it's been fact-checked or it hasn't. If that doesn't work, or if there's a specific, let's say I have a screenshot, and I'm trying to figure out the source of the screenshot or where the information comes from, I'll find a string of words, like let's say 5 words in a row that are fairly unique, put them in quotes and search for that. This also works across languages. Like if I see something on, let's say I got from someone through WeChat or something, you can still do like that search. Maybe it might be hard to actually type the words if you don't have a keyboard for that, but there are ways around that. And then I'll use Google Translate to actually see it now that I've got it on the internet as opposed to not as a screenshot. So there's lots of there's little tricks like that you can use if you're trying to very, very quickly, I mean, in the order of seconds, figure out if something is real. Another good trick, if you're looking at a source, look at media bias fact check, or like search for just media bias fact check. It's fairly reasonable at sort of rating sources by their trust level, or like by how much you should trust them. It has like both their left-right bias and their sort of like likelihood of or like degree of factualness or something. So those are all like quick things that you can do. So you take 15 seconds to figure out if something makes sense. And if you see something that someone posts that doesn't make sense, it's usually a good idea if you have the relationship to do so, to actually tell them. Like fact checking does have some impact for most people. It doesn't for everyone and for every situation. But the research does suggest at this point that it has a significant positive impact.
Right. Thanks. Kim, would you like to add anything?
Yeah. So I did my dissertation on media literacy, but particularly about the power relations, and it was called The Other Side of Media Literacy. And I studied the power relations and interests that influence television news production. So this came out of a career as a media strategist. And so I had spent, a decade and a half before I did my dissertation influencing media so that, certain publics could be informed to change their behaviors or attitudes. And so I looked at how news is made and whose opinions and ideas prevail and why. And so I saw that there's a lot of influences on that end. And then, the way that the media was consumed, that also was, affected. And so anyway, this is something that I've been thinking about and talking about for decades now. And one of the things that I think, my brain is going in 20 million directions. So piggybacking on some of the things that Aviv was saying, when we look at how news has changed since social media has come onto the scene, the whole financing model for the news business is different now. We don't have, the mainstream media. When I was a child, we had ABC, NBC, CBS, and, a little bit of PBS, which was mostly for Sesame Street, and we all trusted Dan Rather and Walter Cronkite. But nowadays, with social media, everybody has a voice, and that's good and bad. I mean, now we get to see things like the Arab Spring and, Occupy Wall Street and Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement. But, the other side of it is that everybody has a voice. And so it's a little bit hard sometimes to wade through who can be trusted and who's reliable and who is in alignment with my own views. And then also recognizing that those mainstream media outlets, many of which had the job in society of doing investigative reporting and fact-checking the government and being the watchdogs, they're now motivated. They have to be motivated by different things because they're not able to pay their reporters. They're not able to pay their newsroom staff. They're not able to finance that sort of mechanism that they used to in the past. So that means that their models are changing as well. I think it was, 2016 or something like that. I was teaching on the communications faculty at Purdue University, and one of my friends who used to be the Moscow bureau chief for the Chicago Tribune during the Cold War, he called me and he said, Kim, the Tribune's out of the news business. And I said, what are you talking about? They still print the Chicago Tribune every day. And he said, yeah, but it's not news anymore. It's content. And so that was a real awakening for me to, when I started looking at what we're calling news with a different eye, I realized that so much of, people look to, comedy show hosts and, talk show commentators like, Rush Limbaugh to get current events. And it's filtered through someone's interpretation of what is news. It's not the who, what, when, where, why, how that I learned how to write when I was, learning how to be a reporter or writer. And so, I think if we can be aware of, are we looking at for secondary sources or primary sources of information? Are we getting it directly from the source? And what interests do they have in telling us certain information? The chair I had when I was at Purdue was the C-SPAN chair. And so I got to know Brian Lamb and understand C-SPAN's business model pretty well. And it's boring because it's absolutely unfiltered, but it's absolutely unfiltered. If you want to see what's happening in Congress, watch C-SPAN.
Yeah, there's a really good article, I think, on how news is more like entertainment, really, at the moment. Aviv, do you want to chime in?
They have to. They have to keep your eyeballs on their stuff.
I would just add that I think that there is also a real danger to the absolutely unfiltered. And by that I mean that often events don't make sense when taken out of context. And so if you watch like C-SPAN every day, like for years, then you might have a sense of what it means that you're seeing. But if you watch, you know, a 10-minute segment of C-SPAN that someone shows you, or if you watch even a 1 hour long, like whatever, like you'll have some context maybe, but you won't know like there is a performance, like there's a performance that's being put on in any of these environments, and you won't necessarily be able to interpret that performance without like these years of context. And in theory, that is what the journalists are bringing to the table. They're bringing that years of contextual understanding. Unfortunately, in the process of doing that, they are adding their own contextual understanding.
They have,
which,
yeah, they have to. That's the job,
right? And so you have to decide, like, is that contextual understanding valuable for you?
Right.
And I think in many cases it really is. It really is valuable to get that context from many people. Like I'll consume something like C-SPAN only when I have really, like, I mean,
a lot of time.
when I'm really curious. What?
A lot of time.
Yeah, a lot of time, or when I'm really curious, or when I know a lot about that particular thing. And even then, I know that I just don't know enough about how DC works, how C-SPAN works, to really understand what is happening.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That is the intermediary's job, is to interpret things and package it. And
Right.
and you know, as consumers, the savvy media consumers, I think we need to understand that someone is filtering it and someone is packaging it for us.
Right.
So and we've all seen those articles or stories where they'll take, you know, it's pretty easy when you say, oh, you know, the car crash happened. There's no disputing the car crash happened, but, you know, things like foreign policy aren't quite so, you know, cut and dried. And so the way Fox News will cover the very same story that MSNBC covers is, you know, you can see neither one is a false story. They're true. You can fact check them, and it's interpreted through someone's lens. So which one are you going to believe? Which one are you going to watch?
Yeah. And I just add the one thing that I think when you're talking about Fox News reporting, that's true. When you're talking about Fox Opinion,
yes,
which is the vast majority of what you see, that may or may not be true.
Well, right.
And that may also be true for other networks, though it's less common.
Sorry, I was talking about.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I missed what you said also.
I was just and these are mainstream media outlets. Like, you know, if we go back to my comment about social media, if you know, consider all of those in the mix, then, you know, everybody could be out there with their own interpretation, and then people are watching, following, listening, and, you know, it is sometimes hard to know what's true and whatever truth means, and who you should believe and talk to, and then they get amplified as we have things like retweeting. So, you know, in terms of a, you know, ecosystem, it's incredibly interesting and dynamic to see how it all.
Yeah, I would love to know. I would love to jump to participant questions in a second, but maybe because you were just bringing up, you know, social media, and, you know, Aviv has been really focusing on social media and, like, you know, really the core of his work, and trying to build more thoughtful technology. So I'd love to see, are there any specific things, Aviv, that you can comment to aid sense making of?
Yeah, I mean, like, that was basically what I was referring to. I wasn't even talking about mainstream media for the most part, because I was assuming that you go to, you know, reliable mainstream sources for the tips that I was describing. When you're talking about media literacy around mainstream media, like that's the sort of thing that people were really, like, that was the main focus of media literacy up until about, you know, 5-10 years ago, basically. And now it's really like this Facebook post from my uncle, like, where did this come from, and is it true? Like, and that's where the sort of tips that I was describing make sense. I'll add one more, which is that if, you know, I mean, again, I mentioned if you have a source that you're not sure about, you know, just search on Google for the site, the URL for that source or the name of that source, and media bias fact check. Or you can also search Wikipedia. So search, like, just put Wikipedia space and right before the URL or the domain name of whatever site it is, and you'll probably get some useful context. Wikipedia is pretty good. It's not perfect, but 99% of the time, it'll be much more useful than you trying to scrounge to figure out, is this a real source? Like, is this, American Society of Physicians or whatever the actual, there's a real one. And then there's like a small conservative group that like sort of pretends to be a real one. Like the real one with like, very few members. And so like, you're not going to find that on your own very easily. You're not going to find it from the website. It's going to be very hard to figure out for many people. But you will find it in a minute or 30 seconds on Wikipedia. And just as a general resource for this, that's if you want to send something to someone who has a fairly, like just the basics of this, this site, control/f.ca, just was put up by Michael Caulfield, who I mentioned last time, or Civics, this media literacy organization in Canada, combination with a few reporters and the person I talked about. So that's a good resource, and I'll just paste it in the chat. Again, it's at the basic level, but it's still very useful for maybe a population that is learning that, whether they're in school or not.
Neat. Okay, I think we also had Paul who would love to ask a question to the panelists before we're going to come to presentations by our other three speakers. And I would love to see if maybe as Paul is asking the question, perhaps Kim and Aviv, as you're answering it, maybe you can also tie in any last words that you'd like to leave participants with in ways that they can go out and aid the process a little bit. So Paul, you're unmuted now.
Okay, thank you, Allison. So the term gaslighting and how it relates to the United States confusion and making sense of it all when you have the President of the United States exercising the fake news phenomenon every chance he can open his mouth. So the tactic of getting people to question their direct experience is a type of psychological manipulation scientists call gaslighting. And this is just in case everyone is not completely familiar with the specifics. A person who is gaslighting an individual or group, could be the entire nation, that they have chosen to target, does so by getting them to doubt their own memory, perception, and reality through persistent lying, misdirection, and contradiction. The gaslighter attempts to delegitimize the victim's belief by confusing and destabilizing them. Gaslighting is a tactic commonly used by sociopaths and narcissists. And I'd like some of the panels to continue that thread and see what comes up about making sense with everything going on.
I don't know what to say to that. I mean, it seems like you have an opinion that you're trying to put forward, and I'm not sure what response you're looking for. Are you looking for someone to agree with you or disagree with you? Or it would be helpful if you could ask a question.
Yeah.
Okay, the question I asked, how does gaslighting come into play in the United States with making sense of everything that's happening here, trying to find some sense of verifiable type information when we're all being confused left and right. So that's the question I have.
The assumption, it sounds like you're assuming that gaslighting is happening.
No, I'm not assuming. I'm speaking from posts that I put on from Psychology Today, talking, I'll be more specific if you like. This is by no means the first time Trump has used gaslighting to manipulate his supporters into doubting their reality, calling Russian intervention in the 2016 presidential election fake news. Now, has anyone heard the term fake news? And is that a form of gaslighting? And how does this enter into the trying to make sense of everything today if everything we hear is fake news? And even regular people like to use the term fake news.
So, I mean, I can just say that I think there's a bunch of different issues wrapped up here. And I think that like, depending on your definition of that term, there's like, I mean, I think there's, well, some definitions of gaslighting involve like sort of knowing that you are saying something that are false. I don't remember if that's what you're describing here, but they're versus just not caring if you're saying things that are false. And those can have, I mean, I guess like I don't want to comment specifically on what's happening in the US, but I would say that I think that that phenomenon is very, very harmful. Like if someone is doing things like gaslighting, that does decrease trust significantly, and it decreases your sense-making capacity. And I think that that's something that we do need to, like, we want to be in a place where that is very much disincentivized if we want to have a healthy public sphere. And where there are consequences for people who are intentionally lying.
If you want to tighten any last words, because in a minute or so, we're going to move to the presentations of participants.
I think, yeah, I mean, I guess like the thing I'm sort of curious about, and maybe this can sort of tie into conversation afterward if we have a few minutes with sort of the broader group, but mechanisms for speeding up or for like, I haven't seen reliable ways to ensure, I think this is mentioned in the comments, which is why I'm bringing it up. I think it's a really important question. I haven't seen reliable ways to avoid having a crisis in terms of ensuring that you're able to handle the crisis. So you have to have, let's say, a tiny crisis that then like makes you a little bit more resistant to a bigger crisis. And like, what are examples of like, I guess I personally want to understand better where are places where we've done that really well as a society, and what are the pieces that we can bring to the U.S. not just for this crisis but going forward, so that we're not
Thank you. We have to tie that back in after the presentations. Kim, any final words?
Well, I'd like to thank you one more time for inviting me to the panel. It's always a pleasure, and I love these stimulating discussions. So thanks for that. And I think this conversation today, in my mind, we started talking about how what we're calling principles, or people who are putting forward a message, how they craft that message and use media to distribute it and make sense and try and inform and influence stakeholders. And that's an art in itself. And we recognize that it happens in a bigger system. It happens. We need consumers of that media and messaging in order to have some place for it to land, and then we move public opinion in society. And that is an art and a science in itself, being a good and savvy critical consumer. And so, like I said, the dynamicism between those two sides and everything that happens in between them and in the environment that it's working is it's just so fascinating. I think we can unpack it from so many angles, and I think we've just scratched the surface. So thanks for opening up that those lines of questioning and giving us a chance to explore it a little bit further.